Staten Island's forgotten corners hold their own secrets. Their abandoned buildings and overgrown lots a silent testament to the passage of time. Among these ruins stands the old Westfield factory, its rusted gates leaning precariously and its broken windows staring like hollow eyes into the darkness. The locals don't talk about the factory much, and those who do keep their voices low. They say the air feels wrong near it, that even the bravest children won't dare cross its crumbling threshold. This isn't just an old building. It's the home of Chopsey. The legend of Chopsey has haunted Staten Island for as long as anyone can remember. He's the figure parents invoke when their children refuse to come home before dark, the ghost they blame when a toy is left out and forgotten. Chopsey is said to be the caretaker of the forgotten, a shadowy figure who roams the factory ruins, searching for children to take. Some say he was a man once, a caretaker at the old Willowbrook Asylum that stood near the factory. When the asylum burned to the ground in 1927, dozens of children perished in the flames. Chopsey, the story goes, was one of the only survivors, his body disfigured and his mind shattered by the tragedy. They say he returned to the ruins, consumed by grief, and began taking children to replace the ones he lost. Others claim Chopsey was never human at all. They speak of a dark force tied to the land itself, one that thrives on fear and despair. Whatever he is, one thing is certain: those who enter the factory at night rarely return. The first account of Chopsey dates back to 1934, when a group of teenagers decided to test their courage by spending the night in the factory. They brought flashlights and snacks, laughing as they climbed over the broken gates and into the decaying structure. The laughter didn't last. The police found their belongings the next morning: blankets, flashlights, and half-eaten sandwiches scattered across the floor of the factory's main hall. But the teenagers were nowhere to be found. The only clue to their fate was a series of deep scratches on the walls, as though something with claws had been dragging them toward the basement. Over the years, more stories emerged. A delivery driver passing the factory late at night swore he saw a hunched figure dragging a sack into the woods. A young boy claimed he heard his name whispered from the shadows as he rode his bike past the gates. And then there were the claw marks, always fresh, always pointing toward the basement. By the 1970s, the factory had become a local legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones and visited only by those foolish enough to tempt fate. Parents warned their children to stay away, and even the bravest locals refused to set foot near it after sunset. But the stories didn't end with the factory. In recent years, there have been reports of Chopsey appearing far from his supposed lair. Children walking home from school claim to see a shadowy figure following them, its form hunched and unnatural. Residents have reported hearing faint, raspy voices calling their names from empty alleyways. The most chilling accounts come from those who ventured too close to the factory. One young man, dared by his friends to spend an hour inside, returned pale and trembling, refusing to speak about what he saw. When his parents finally coaxed him into talking, he whispered one word: Chopsey. And then there was the boy who disappeared last spring. 11-year-old Tommy Gresham was last seen riding his bike near the factory at dusk. His parents searched the area for hours, but all they found was his bike, lying on its side near the gates. The next morning, a search party discovered scratch marks on the factory walls and a single, blooded sneaker at the entrance to the basement. Tommy was never seen again. Despite the fear surrounding the legend, there are those who dismiss Chopsey as nothing more than a story, a cautionary tale to keep children out of dangerous places. But for the people who have heard his voice, who have felt the cold breath of something unseen on their necks, the legend is all too real. The factory still stands, its gates leaning like crooked teeth, its halls filled with shadows. And at its heart, they say, Chopsey waits, watching, listening, and searching for his next victim. Because Chopsey isn't just a story, he's real, and he's never far away. Staten Island carries a strange, heavy silence, the kind that feels unnatural in the bustle of the modern world. Its residents would never admit it aloud, but they live in the shadow of fear, a fear that clings to them like a shroud. It's the unspoken agreement. Stay away from the old factory, don't let your children wander after dark, and never, ever answer the voice calling your name from the woods. The legend of Chopsey isn't just a story here. It's a part of the air, the soil, the way the town moves. Parents pass down the warnings in hushed tones. Children whisper the tales at sleepovers, and even the skeptics lock their doors tightly at night. It's a town on edge, haunted not by what they've seen, but by what they can't explain. Clara Hayes arrived in Staten Island on a misty autumn morning, the air damp and heavy as she drove along the cracked, narrow roads. A journalist and filmmaker, Clara had made a name for herself chasing urban legends, debunking myths, and uncovering the truth behind stories that most dismissed as fantasy. Chopsey was her next subject, a local legend with enough weight to justify the trip. She pulled into the parking lot of a weathered diner, the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. The neon sign flickered weakly, and a group of elderly men sat near the window, their faces lined with the weight of stories untold. As Clara entered, the conversation seemed to falter, the air thick with unspoken suspicion. She approached the counter, where a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a name tag reading Linda was pouring coffee. "You're not from around here," Linda said without looking up. Clara offered a polite smile. "Just passing through. I'm working on a documentary about local legends. I heard about Chopsey." The room fell silent. Even the old men stopped their murmuring, their eyes turning toward her with expressions that ranged from wary to outright hostile. Linda set the coffee pot down with a sharp clink. "You'd do well to leave that one alone," she said, her voice low. Undeterred, Clara spent the day gathering accounts from the locals, though most were reluctant to speak. A few younger residents dismissed Chopsey as a fairy tale, but their words felt hollow, as if they were trying to convince themselves. One teenage boy, clearly eager to impress, leaned in conspiratorially. "The factory? That place is cursed," he said. "You go in there, you don't come out. Or if you do, you're not the same. My buddy Jason went in on a dare last year. Came back pale as a ghost. Said he heard someone calling his name. But when he turned around, there was nobody there." Clara pressed for details, but the boy shook his head, suddenly uneasy. "I don't know. All I'm saying is, don't go there at night. He's waiting for you." By late afternoon, Clara found herself at the doorstep of Mr. Donovan, a retired factory worker and lifelong Staten Island resident. His home was modest, the porch cluttered with rusted tools and potted plants, but the man who greeted her had an intensity in his eyes that stopped her in her tracks. "Chopsey," Donovan said, his voice gruff. "You've got no business digging into that." "I'm trying to understand the legend," Clara replied. "I want to hear the truth, not just the stories." Donovan hesitated, then motioned for her to follow him inside. His living room was dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves of books and photographs. He poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting heavily in a worn armchair. "You want the truth," he said. "The truth is, there's things in this world you don't mess with. Chopsey's one of them." He spoke in halting sentences, his words tinged with bitterness and fear. He told Clara about the asylum that had once stood near the factory, about the fire that had claimed so many lives, and about the caretaker named Edgar Harper. "Edgar wasn't right in the head," Donovan said. "Kept to himself, didn't talk much. But he loved those kids in his own way. When the fire started, they say he tried to save them. Burned his own skin trying to pull them out. But he couldn't save them all. And something inside him snapped." Clara listened intently, scribbling notes as Donovan recounted the stories that had followed. The sightings of a shadowy figure dragging children into the woods. The claw marks that appeared near the factory. The whispers in the night. "It's not just a story," Donovan said, his voice trembling. "He's still out there. And he's still taking them." That evening, Clara drove to the factory, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road. The building loomed ahead, its rusted gates partially open as if inviting her in. She parked her car and stepped out, her camera in hand. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Clara hesitated at the gates, her heart pounding as she took her first steps inside. The factory was a monument to decay. Its walls were covered in graffiti, the floor littered with broken glass and debris. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixing with something sharper, something metallic. Clara wandered through the main hall, her camera capturing every detail. She noticed the scratches on the walls, deep and deliberate, as though something, or someone, had clawed at the surface. As she moved deeper into the building, the light from her flashlight seemed to dim, the shadows growing longer and darker. The air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. It was a whisper. Clara. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The voice was soft, raspy, and unmistakably calling her name. Clara. The sound seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the empty halls. She turned, her camera recording as she searched for the source. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hall, its form hunched and shrouded in darkness. Its head tilted as if watching her, its breath visible in the cold air. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She raised her camera, the lens shaking as she tried to focus on the figure. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Clara reviewed the footage later that night in her motel room. Her hands trembled as she paused on a single frame. The figure was closer than she had realized, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The footage Clara had captured haunted her long after the screen went dark. She could see it even with her eyes closed, the hunched figure, its hollow eyes staring from the shadows, as though it had been watching her the entire time. The air in her motel room felt heavier now, the walls closer, the silence pressing down like a weight. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. The raspy whisper calling her name, the figure standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Clara had spent years chasing legends, uncovering the truth behind the myths people told to scare each other. But this was different. This wasn't a story. This was real. The next morning, Clara returned to the factory, her determination outweighing her fear. The daylight didn't make the place feel any less foreboding. The factory loomed like a monument to decay, its jagged edges casting long shadows over the overgrown lot. She crossed the threshold cautiously, the crunch of broken glass beneath her boots echoing in the emptiness. The air was colder here, and every sound seemed amplified, from the creak of the rusted beams above to the faint rustle of leaves outside. Her goal was clear. She needed to find the source of the legend, the truth that had birthed Chopsey. The scratches on the walls, the whispers in the air, they all pointed to something buried deep within the factory. Clara's research had revealed a dark history. Before the factory, there had been an asylum, a place meant to care for Staten Island's most vulnerable children but infamous for its cruelty and neglect. Willowbrook Asylum had been a grim institution, its halls filled with the cries of the forgotten and the abandoned. When the fire consumed the asylum in 1927, it wasn't just the building that burned. Dozens of children perished in the flames, their bodies never recovered. Survivors spoke of a man who had tried to save them, Edgar Harper, the asylum's caretaker. The records described him as quiet, unassuming, and fiercely devoted to the children under his care. But after the fire, Edgar changed. Witnesses claimed he wandered the ruins at night, calling out to the children who had died, his voice cracked and desperate. Some said he blamed himself for their deaths. Others believed he had started the fire himself, driven mad by years of isolation and despair. Whatever the truth, Edgar disappeared shortly after the fire. His name became a whisper, and over time, the legend of Chopsey took its place. As Clara explored the factory, she noticed something she hadn't seen during her first visit. A rusted metal door partially hidden behind a collapsed beam. The door was padlocked, the lock thick with rust, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Her flashlight illuminated faint scratches around the edges of the door, claw marks etched deep into the metal. They were erratic, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had been frantic to get inside. Clara's pulse quickened as she examined the door. This had to be it. The basement. The stories all pointed to this place as the heart of the legend, the place where Chopsey's presence was strongest. She retrieved a crowbar from her bag and began prying at the lock. The metal groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the factory like a scream. Finally, the lock gave way, clattering to the ground. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and something sharper, something metallic. Clara hesitated, her flashlight barely penetrating the darkness below. She knew she should wait, come back with backup or at least better equipment. But the pull of the story, the need to know, was too strong. She descended the stairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The walls were lined with old pipes, their surfaces slick with condensation. The further she went, the colder it became, until her breath formed visible clouds in front of her. The room at the bottom of the stairs was larger than Clara had expected, its walls lined with rusted shelves and broken furniture. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends frayed and twisted. In the center of the room stood a chair, its surface covered in scratches. Around it, scattered like offerings, were children's belongings, shoes, dolls, and faded photographs. Clara's flashlight trembled in her hand as she stepped closer. She knelt to examine one of the photographs, a black and white image of a young girl, her face partially burned away by time. And then she heard it. The whisper. Clara. She froze, her heart pounding as the voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. Clara, come closer. Her flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the beam returned, she saw it. A figure standing in the far corner, its form hunched and misshapen. The breath caught in her throat as she raised her flashlight, its beam revealing more of the figure. Its clothes were tattered, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. And its face. The hollow eyes stared back at her, glowing faintly in the darkness. Why did you come here? The figure rasped, its voice like the scrape of metal against stone. Clara didn't wait for an answer. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps followed her, each step accompanied by the scrape of claws against concrete. She burst into the factory's main hall, the faint light of the afternoon streaming through the broken windows. The footsteps stopped abruptly, the silence almost more terrifying than the noise. Clara turned, her chest heaving, but the figure was gone. The basement door stood open, a gaping black hole in the floor. She didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing her bag, she fled the factory, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. That night, Clara reviewed the footage from her camera. The shaky images of the basement, the chair, and the children's belongings all seemed surreal now, like fragments of a nightmare. But it was the final moments that chilled her to the bone. As she fled up the stairs, the camera captured a single frame of the figure at the bottom, its face turned upward, its glowing eyes fixed directly on her. And then, just before the footage ended, the figure raised a clawed hand and pointed toward the lens. Clara didn't sleep that night. The motel room felt too small, its walls pressing in on her as though trying to suffocate her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure from the basement, its hollow eyes fixed on hers, its clawed hand pointing as if it had chosen her for something she couldn't yet understand. The camera sat on the desk, its battery drained from the hours she'd spent reviewing the footage. No matter how many times she watched it, she couldn't escape the feeling that the figure had been more than just a presence in the room. It had been aware of her. As dawn broke, Clara knew she couldn't leave. She had come to Staten Island to find the truth behind Chopsey's legend, and now she was part of it. If she left, she would never forgive herself, or escape the shadow that now followed her. But if she stayed, she had to face the reality that the stories might be far darker than she had ever imagined. She spent the morning in the library, combing through old newspaper archives and town records. The fire at Willowbrook Asylum had been a tragedy, but the reports of neglect and abuse that preceded it painted an even grimmer picture. Children locked in overcrowded rooms, left without proper care or food. Staff members accused of cruelty, their punishments swift and brutal. And then there was Edgar Harper, the caretaker who had survived the fire but disappeared soon after. Witness accounts of Edgar's behavior in the months before the fire were chilling. He had been devoted to the children, but his grief and anger at their mistreatment had grown into something dangerous. Staff members reported seeing him pacing the halls at night, muttering to himself, his hands clenched into fists. One nurse claimed she had found him standing outside a child's room, whispering something she couldn't understand. When the fire broke out, Edgar had been seen trying to save the children, pulling them from the flames even as his own skin blistered and burned. But when the fire was extinguished, Edgar was nowhere to be found. Some believed he had perished in the flames. Others thought he had fled, consumed by guilt or madness. And then the sightings began. The first reports came just weeks after the fire. A delivery driver claimed he had seen a figure standing in the ruins of the asylum, its body hunched and disfigured. A group of children playing near the factory reported hearing whispers calling their names, only to find no one there. And then there were the disappearances. Over the years, dozens of children vanished near the factory, their belongings found scattered around the site. Each disappearance brought new rumors, new whispers of Chopsey. Parents warned their children to stay away, and the factory became a place of fear, its walls a silent witness to the horrors that had taken root there. Clara's hands trembled as she read the accounts. The deeper she delved, the more the story seemed to tighten around her, pulling her into its depths. She found an old photograph of Edgar Harper, taken just weeks before the fire. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as though he were already a shadow of the man he had once been. By midday, Clara knew she needed answers she couldn't find in the archives. She returned to Mr. Donovan's house, her questions burning in her mind. The old man was reluctant to talk, but Clara's insistence finally wore him down. He told her about the asylum, about the fear and shame that had festered in the town after the fire. But it was what he said next that sent a chill through her. "You're connected to this," Donovan said, his voice low. "You wouldn't have come here if you weren't. Chopsey doesn't just take anyone. He chooses them. And once he's chosen you, there's no going back." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? Why would he choose me?" Donovan hesitated, then handed her a faded envelope. Inside were letters written by Clara's great-grandmother, a nurse who had worked at the asylum before the fire. The letters spoke of the horrors she had witnessed, the children she couldn't save, and the guilt that had consumed her. But it was the final letter that struck Clara the hardest. In it, her great-grandmother described Edgar Harper in detail, his devotion to the children, his anger at their suffering, and the strange, almost otherworldly presence that seemed to surround him in the days leading up to the fire. She wrote of seeing him standing in the basement, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "I should have stopped him," the letter read. "But I was too afraid. And now, I fear he will never leave." Clara felt the weight of the connection settle over her like a shroud. She wasn't just an observer in this story. She was a part of it. And Chopsey knew. That night, Clara sat in her motel room, staring at the letters spread out on the bed. The whispers she had heard in the factory played over and over in her mind, blending with the words of her great-grandmother. She could feel the pull of the story, the inescapable gravity of what she had uncovered. As she reached for her camera, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the message on the screen. "Come back. We're waiting." She froze, the phone trembling in her hand. The message had no sender, no number, no indication of where it had come from. But she knew. The next day, Clara made her preparations. She packed her bag with supplies, flashlights, matches, a crowbar, and a recorder. She didn't know what she would find when she returned to the factory, but she knew she couldn't walk away. The truth was there, buried in the darkness, and she had to face it. As the sun set over Staten Island, Clara stood at the gates of the factory once more. The air was colder than it had been the night before, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. She gripped her flashlight tightly, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The factory seemed alive now, its walls pulsing with an energy she couldn't explain. The claw marks on the walls were fresher, deeper, as though they had been made just moments before. The whispers began almost immediately, faint and indistinct, growing louder with each step she took. Clara. The voice was clear now, echoing through the halls. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a call. And she knew there was no turning back. The factory seemed to close in around Clara as she moved deeper into its shadowed halls. The flashlight in her hand flickered, its weak beam struggling to pierce the oppressive darkness. Every step she took echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed by the weight of the air. She could feel it now, something watching her, its presence lingering just beyond the edge of the light. The whispers had grown louder, no longer faint suggestions but clear, insistent voices calling her name. They came from all directions, overlapping, shifting from soft murmurs to sharp, commanding tones. Clara's pulse quickened, but she pressed forward, her determination stronger than her fear. The basement was where it had all begun, and it was where she would find the answers she had come for. The descent into the basement felt longer this time. The air grew colder with each step, the damp stone walls slick beneath her fingers as she steadied herself. Her flashlight cast jagged shadows, its light catching the rusted chains that still hung from the ceiling. The room at the bottom was just as she remembered it, filled with discarded children's belongings, the chair at its center scratched and worn, as if it had borne witness to countless struggles. But now, the room felt different. The shadows were deeper, shifting unnaturally as though alive. The claw marks on the walls seemed to pulse faintly, glowing with a dim, sickly light. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning every corner for movement. Then she saw him. Chopsey stood near the far wall, his hunched figure blending with the shadows. His tattered clothing clung to his gaunt frame, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. The hollow eyes she had seen in the footage now burned with a faint, otherworldly light, and his head tilted slightly, as though studying her. "Why did you come back?" he rasped, his voice like the scrape of metal on stone. Clara froze, her hand tightening around the flashlight. The voice reverberated through the room, each word laced with something that felt ancient, heavy, and cold. "I need to know the truth," she managed, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Chopsey's head tilted further, his form shifting as he stepped closer. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "You already know," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You're part of it. You've always been part of it." Clara's heart pounded as his words sank in. She thought of the letters from her great-grandmother, the guilt that had haunted her family for generations, the whispers she had heard, the connection she had felt. It all led back to this moment. As Chopsey moved closer, Clara backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe, reaching out toward her like living things. She tripped over a discarded toy and fell hard to the ground, the flashlight slipping from her grasp. Darkness swallowed the room, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a single whisper, "Clara." The voice came from right behind her, cold breath brushing against her neck. Clara scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling for the flashlight. When she turned it on, the beam caught Chopsey's face inches from hers. His hollow eyes bore into hers, his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "This is where it ends." Clara's mind raced as she searched for a way out. Her fingers brushed against the matches in her pocket, and an idea sparked. The room felt alive, its energy pulsing around her, and she realized that the belongings scattered across the floor, shoes, dolls, photographs, were not just relics. They were anchors, tethering Chopsey to this place. She lit a match and held it to the edge of a worn photograph. The flame caught quickly, spreading to the edges of the paper. Chopsey let out a guttural roar, his form flickering like a dying flame. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. Clara didn't answer. She grabbed another object, a doll with a missing eye, and held it to the fire. The room seemed to shake, the shadows convulsing as Chopsey's form grew more unstable. "You can't destroy me," he screamed, his voice rising to a deafening pitch. But Clara kept going, lighting one item after another, the flames consuming the remnants of the past. With each piece destroyed, Chopsey's form grew weaker, his movements more erratic. The whispers in the room grew louder, merging into a chorus of voices, children's voices, pleading and crying out for release. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls and consuming the chains that hung from the ceiling. Clara felt the heat against her skin as she backed toward the stairs, her eyes never leaving Chopsey. His form twisted and writhed, his screams turning into guttural roars. "You can't escape it," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "You're part of this now." With a final, ear-splitting roar, Chopsey's form disintegrated, dissolving into the shadows that consumed the room. The air grew still, the oppressive energy lifting as the flames roared higher. Clara turned and ran, the heat chasing her up the stairs and through the factory. She burst into the open air just as the fire engulfed the building, the flames reaching into the night sky like grasping hands. The factory burned for hours, its skeletal remains crumbling into ash as Clara watched from a distance. The whispers were gone, the weight of the air lifted, but the memory of Chopsey lingered. In the weeks that followed, the town of Staten Island seemed lighter, freer. The stories of Chopsey began to fade, his legend reduced to whispers and fading graffiti on the factory's ruins. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. She reviewed her footage, her notes, the evidence she had gathered, but there was something she couldn't explain. One night, as she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a notification. She opened the message and froze. It was a photo taken from her camera. In the background of the burning factory, just barely visible through the flames, was a shadowy figure. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. A second message appeared, and it was only 3 words. "You're not done."